So I'd like to welcome our first guest. Salve Regina University received a $180,000 grant to conduct an independent cybersecurity defense research project to look at constructive training environment. So I'd like to introduce Jennifer McArdle. She's assistant professor in the Administration of Justice and Homeland Security. Hi Jennifer, how are you doing?
Hi Molly, I'm good. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, thanks for coming in. So it's pretty exciting the work that you do over at Salve Regina. A lot of programs going on, and you're kind of our go-to for cybersecurity, so we're glad to have you today.
Well, thanks for having me.
So this is a pretty neat opportunity for the work that you're doing. You're going to be doing this research project about a year and a half, and then presenting it in DC, which seems like a neat opportunity not only for the college, but for the students involved. So why don't you just walk us through a little bit about what you'll be doing?
Sure. So the project looks at cyber operations in the military synthetic training environment. So what I mean by that is there's a bunch of different ways that the military trains. One is live. So when you think about live training, you're thinking about Tom Cruise and Top Gun. So fighter jets on fighter jets. Another is virtual. And basically, this is when you have these giant simulators where they'll project this virtual image in the simulator. And the inside of the simulator could look like the inside of an aircraft or a tank. And you will train that way. And another is constructive. And constructive training is how we train command and control. So these are the people that are leading campaigns in war. And that is when you've got a synthetic system with synthetic people in it. So basically, you'll set the parameters and you'll see a scenario play out and you'll decide whether that's a useful operation in a future combat scenario. So when we talk about cyber operations in the military synthetic training environment, we're basically looking at two big things. So one is, how do you protect that training environment from cyber operations, so potential cyber attacks, considering it's built on information communication technology. And the second is, how do we inject in networked effects into that training environment so that people in the military, not just the cyber warriors, can train for those kind of operations in warfare.
Wow. So it's a pretty big deal because you're looking at not only how all the operations work, but you're also going to be kind of looking at what can make it better, right?
Yes.
So talk to me just a little bit about what this means for other people involved. How can students be involved in this project? Because you're not taking very many.
Yes, so we're only taking 10 students. You have to apply for this research project. So it's definitely a hard research project to get into, but it's a really unique opportunity for students. So one, they get to learn a lot from a research perspective. They're going to learn how to construct a research question, do lit reviews, and do in-depth research, not just on the cyber side, but on the defense policy side. They also get to interface a lot with the defense industrial base, the defense policy community in DC, and the military. So I'll actually be taking all 10 students down to Washington, DC, where they're going to have the opportunity to meet with CAE, which is a military training company that's funding this project. So they'll get to meet with this company in the defense industrial base. They'll be able to meet with what we call a think tank. So it's a research institute in DC that informs the kind of defense dialogue that's going on in DC. So they'll get to meet with that community to understand how that world works. And then they'll also be going to the Pentagon. So they'll be able to go on a tour of the Pentagon. They'll be able to meet with people that work in the Pentagon and learn what it's like to work for the DoD itself. So they get a great network opportunity, a great research opportunity. And then on top of it too, one of the great things to know in DC is grant management. So how do you manage a grant? What do you do when you receive one? How do you interface with your client? And we're going to be teaching them grant management. They'll actually be doing the lead work on grant management in this project as well. So that'll be a useful thing to have on their resume.
I mean, all this stuff, that's just huge potential. And not only will you be, students just getting this huge potential, but you're also, the influence on, it's a research project. So what you find will also could be beneficial for the United States military, correct?
Yes, so when we do this project, I'll be working very closely with the military on this. So I have talked to various members of the military that are designing their synthetic training strategy for their service. So I've talked to the Army's lead when it comes to synthetic training. I've talked to members of the Air Force about this and members of the Navy. So we'll definitely be in contact with the military on this. But on top of it, the think tank that I'm affiliated with DC, who's involved with this project, the American Foreign Policy Council, they run a defense technology briefing for congressional staffers every 2 months. So we'll be going down, we'll be briefing the Hill on our findings from this project.
Wow, that's incredible. So let's talk a little bit about what the study will be involved in. Talk me through, like day-to-day stuff, or, just in general what you'll be looking at when you're working on the study. It's a year and a half.
Yes.
I mean, that's a good amount of work.
Yeah, so on the research side, there's obviously the two main questions. So the cyber threats to the synthetic environment, and how do you inject in these networked effects? And when we talk about network effects, we're talking about cyber attacks, electronic warfare, which is basically when an adversary uses the electromagnetic spectrum or directed energy to attack a person. So to put in perspective, the electromagnetic spectrum, the radio frequency of it is your Wi-Fi. So it's basically just cutting off comms. And then there is information ops. So how do you manipulate the information environment of your adversary so that they make the wrong decisions? So we're going to look at, on the research side, how are key potential adversaries like China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, how are they thinking about cyber information and electronic operations? And based on how they're thinking about it, how do we inject that into the training environment so the military can train for those kind of scenarios? On the cyber side, we're looking at, there's something in information security called the CIA triad, which shouldn't be mistaken with the intelligence community agency down in DC. So basically it stands for the confidentiality of data, the integrity of data, and the accessibility of data. And so basically we're going to look at how do you protect data so that it remains confidential within the synthetic training environment so that an adversary doesn't access it and use it so they know our future plans. Okay. How do we protect the integrity of that data so that it's not manipulated so we have the wrong training end? And then how do we make sure that we are you always able to access that data within the training environment so that we can access our training systems? You could potentially cut it off and sabotage the training environment from the cyber side. So those are the two big research questions. So from that we'll produce a big monograph, so about a 90-page monograph that will ideally inform the defense policy debate that's going on. We'll be having a big monograph launch up in Newport, so we'll be inviting up about 35 members of the military and the defense community, and they'll be able to be part of this 1.5 day long conference. And then we'll, of course, be going down to DC and briefing this on the Hill. So those are the three big parts of this project over a year and a half.
I mean, so as a civilian person who has not had any experience in this at all, when you say keywords like Russia, North Korea, and wanting to prevent access to simulations for the military, my brain instantly goes, wow, this could be huge. Because you obviously, I would think we don't want anyone to get our hands on our simulated training, right? So this potentially could be, the results of this could be huge. Because who knows what you might find, right? There could be vulnerabilities in the system, there could be ways to improve the system, or you might find out, hey, we're set, right?
Yeah, I mean, of course you want to make sure that any system that you have is cyber secure. You don't want to make sure that any adversary can have access to it. But then also, a big part of this is we need to figure out how we train for future conflicts. And that's tough. If you don't have the proper training when you're in war, you could have outcomes that you don't necessarily like. So for example, a good example of this actually is in Vietnam. In Vietnam, even though we had superior hardware, we were actually losing about 35 members of the Air Force per month because we just didn't have the proper training for the adversary that we were coming up against. And one of the biggest training programs came out of that, and that was Red Flag. So that's the fighter-on-fighter training that you see in Top Gun. But proper training is really important. So us figuring out, all right, well, this is what the future war looks like. It's going to have these networked effects. How do we train for that is really important. So we want to make sure that, the members of the military get the training that they need.
And so that's why this can be so crucial, not only for the people involved in the military services, but for civilians as well, right? Because they're the ones defending us.
Yes, of course, yes.
So I find this extremely exciting, especially since it's happening in our own backyard. I find it extremely exciting. Talk to me a little bit just about what we're going to be seeing, how you're going to gather this data, and then the information, how you're going to present. You talked a little bit about how you're going to present it, but when you're gathering the data, how you see it moving forward.
Sure. So we actually brought in some high-level consultants on this project too, which is really nice for the students because they'll get to interface with them. So a person that I used to work with closely in DC, he's the former head of the Royal Canadian Air Force. So Lieutenant General Blondin is going to be working as a military advisor on this. We have a person named Richard Betchlich who has done high-level incident response on the cyber side, so he'll be working on this. Then we have a guy named Ben Buchanan who's at Harvard who's done a lot of work on the cyber side as well. And a person named Iskander Raymond who's also at Salve that's done a lot of scenario development in Asia. So I'll be working with them to kind of design research questions and to guide the research, but from there basically I'll be working with the 10 students to go out and find documents that these various governments have released and basically do a deep dive and try to figure out if we can identify key tactics, techniques, and procedures that these governments are thinking about from, a cyber and information or an electronic side that could potentially inform how the military should be thinking about training.
Wow. It's going to be intense. As we move forward as well, we're looking at, to talk a little bit about the cyber and the simulation types of training. I think a lot of people are interested in the terms of just virtual reality. How much does the military use virtual reality in their types of training when it comes to things like this?
Sure. So obviously the virtual side of training gets a lot. It is basically virtual reality training. Like you're in a simulator and you've got this virtual projection. It's high fidelity, which basically means it's incredibly, incredibly realistic. And what you all might be familiar with when we talk about virtual reality is things like Oculus Rift. So it's those crazy headsets you put on, and you look around and everything looks like I don't know, like Orlando, Florida, or you're in space or whatever it might be.
Swimming with sharks.
Yes,
that I think was the most wild experience.
Oh, you did that with virtual reality?
Yeah.
Oh, I hate sharks.
So don't imagine that then.
But yeah, so actually it's really interesting. So the commercial world oftentimes influences the military, and the military sometimes influences the commercial world. So and this happens when it comes to virtual reality applications and things like video games. So there's this video game called Doom. And I don't know, some of you might have played it before, but what came out, it was such a successful video game that the military looked at it and they were like, wow, that would be an impressive training tool. So they created this game called Marine Doom out of it to train the military. In other cases, you'll see elements of first-person shooter games taken out and then put into military gaming devices. The Pentagon will actually hire video game developers to think about the future of warfare so that they can design their own games or their own virtual reality simulations. So in some cases you've got the Pentagon designing these future virtual reality gaming applications that will eventually make its way back into the commercial world. And in other cases the commercial world's at the front and the Pentagon will say, hey, we want that, and they'll figure out ways to adapt it for their own ends.
Wow. Wow. And do you think that's just puts people in those scenarios where you have to do quick real-time thinking?
Yeah, I mean, that's the idea. The more that you practice that quick thinking that's based on a given scenario, or those tactile movements, whether it's like, I don't know, shooting a gun or whatever it might be, the more used to it you are when you do it, so that ideally when you're in a very high stress environment in the real world, you know exactly what to do very, very quickly.
So interesting. So you are getting to work on this, but you also have a lot of other things that you're working on and planning on as the school gets back to work here. You have another round of the Warrior Women panel discussion coming up soon, October 5th, which we will have one of your guests in studio, which I'm very excited about. Tell me what this round will be featuring.
Sure. So the Warrior Women series is basically a series designed to empower young women to pursue careers in national security and to kind of learn a little bit about the careers that are open to them, but then also some of the various strategies for success. So the theme for this semester is Warrior Women STEM, so that's science, technology, engineering, and math. So we've got 2 women flying up from DC. One is a scientist by training. She's a biologist. She's worked for the intelligence community, the State Department, and the National Defense University. Now she's at Georgetown leading the science and tech program for international affairs. And then the second is actually a social scientist by training, but she's been able to take her social science skills and applied them in the technical world. So she works at a company called Endgame, which is a hard cybersecurity company. So I'm hoping between those two women, they can kind of show like what are the kind of career opportunities that are available in tech, and how you can get them regardless whether you're a scientist or a non-scientist. I think it should be really interesting. I'm excited about it.
I'm excited too, yeah, and we're going to be having her, we're having the speaker from Endgame here on October 5th, so looking forward. She's coming, you are picking her up, bringing her straight from the airport.
So Andrea Lumbago is, as I said, she's a social scientist. She spent time in the Department of Defense, now she's at Endgame, and she has spoken nationally on women in cyber, so she's a really good voice for women in cyber. So if you're interested in that, definitely tune into Molly's show.
Yeah, it's going to be good. We're really looking forward to having her, just a high level, super intelligent, and an expert in her field. So we're glad that she's making this stop at Salve Regina and speaking at this conference, or this panel discussion, and then she's stopping here on the way down there, so we're looking forward to that.
Well, thanks, Molly.
Yeah, definitely. So congratulations on the grant and the research opportunity. Looking forward to hearing the results. It's a little ways out there, but looking forward to that. So thanks for coming in to Go Look Live. Appreciate you having
thanks,
here.
Molly. I appreciate it.
Yeah.